30 nights, no touch, no answer that wasn't tomorrow. If you have ever felt your own home turn into a museum of silence, you know the sound a ceiling fan makes when it keeps time with your doubts. Tonight, our story begins with a husband who counted every click, a wife who weaponized distance, and a single email that cracked the surface, off-site bonus, discretion. What followed wasn't a shouting match. It was something colder, a pattern, a clause with teeth, and a voice memo that changed everything. Before we dive in, if you want more high-stakes, no-nonsense cheating stories told with real consequence, subscribe to Cheating Stories 7, like this video to help it reach others, and tell me in the comments. When does I need time become manipulation? All right, take a breath. Let's step into She Denied Me Intimacy for 30 Nights, a cheating wife exposed. The wedding photos looked like a promise framed in glass. Champagne caught the light as if it had something hopeful to confess. Friends clapped until their hands reddened. My mother cried into a linen napkin and told me that real love is patient. I believed her. I believed the speeches, the white cake, the way Clara slid her fingers into mine beneath the table, as if our palms had already learned a private alphabet. The first night home, I reached for that alphabet again. She slipped from it like a smooth stone, escaping wet fingers. I am exhausted, she said, turning away. Tomorrow. Tomorrow arrived and sat at the foot of our bed like a polite stranger who did not know when to leave. Clara answered emails that did not need answers. She let videos autoplay themselves into silence. When I brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, she tucked her face deeper into the pillow. The glow of her phone pooled a sterile blue along her cheek. I said nothing because I loved her, and because I was taught that gentleness mends what force only breaks. Night 3 tasted like aspirin and apologies. Night 6 smelled of citrus body wash and distance. By night 10, I knew the mattress by latitude and longitude. The long cold of the left edge where I waited, the small warm dip that would have been her hip if she had rolled toward me. When I asked if she was okay, she said work was heavy, clients impossible. When I asked how I could help, she said it was not about me. That sentence is a room with too many doors. You cannot tell which one leads back to the person you love. In public, she was effortless. At dinner with friends, she laughed in a way that made other tables glance over. She posted a clip from our reception, typed warm captions about forever, replied to comments with hearts. At home, she kept her phone between us like a night watchman. On night 15, I tried naming what was happening without sounding like an audit. I miss you, I said into the dark. I miss us. I have been clear, she answered, not unkindly, simply cleanly. I need time. Time is generous to those who request it and stingy to those who wait. It handed her reasons that were not lies, only convenient truths. A migraine, a bloated afternoon, a review cycle that stole sleep. It handed me arithmetic. 1 month equals 30 denials. 1 man equals the weight of 30 denials in his chest. By night 23, I reached for her hand, and she moved it away without looking at me. The way one moves a glass from the edge of a table. That was when shame began, quiet and efficient. I learned how to fold need into a shape small enough to hide inside a drawer. Work did not help. My code looked like a language I once spoke fluently. Coffee went cold beside a list of tasks that would have taken me an hour before the wedding and now required 2. People congratulated me in hallways and asked about the honeymoon. I told them it was peaceful. In a way it was. Peace has a dark twin that looks like emptiness if you stare too long. When the 30th night arrived, it arrived wearing its number. I counted the clicks of the ceiling fan and thought about vows we had traded with steady voices. Health and sickness, joy and sorrow, the easy and the hard. Vows do not enforce themselves. They need daily touch to keep from fraying. Clara, I said, and my voice surprised me. It sounded like a handrail. We have been married a month. You have not touched me once. I need to know if this is temporary or if I am the only person in this bed who wants a marriage. She did not roll over. She did not sigh. She looked toward a dark corner as if the answer were written there. My body, my choice, she said. You have no right. The words were correct in theory and cruel in practice. Autonomy should be a boundary held with care, not a blade pressed to the throat of trust. I wanted to argue ethics, to say love requires both consent and closeness. That one without the other turns a home into an exhibit. I swallowed the speech and listened to the fan slice the room into quarters. At breakfast, she was cheerful, almost buoyant, tapping messages as the coffee cooled. She kissed my cheek on her way out, a precise brush that could have been delivered to a cousin. The apartment door clicked shut with a professional little sound. An hour later, while clearing spam, I noticed a subject line that did not belong with coupon codes and shipping notices. Off-site confirmation. The sender was Ree Caldwell, a name with the hard shine of magazine profiles. The preview offered 3 words that refused to leave my mind even after I closed the pane. Green light bonus terms. There was also one more. Discretion. Corporate logistics can look grimy without being wrong. I told myself that. I also remembered the way Clara's posture changed when the phone lit up with certain names. The way she smoothed her hair back and glanced toward the hallway as if walls could carry gossip. I put on a jacket and walked to the county courthouse. The building smelled like polished wood and old ink. People spoke quietly, as if sound itself had to sign for entry. At the clerk's window, a woman slid forms toward me with the calm efficiency of someone who witnesses 100 endings before lunch. I filled in the blanks my hands knew how to fill. On the line that asked for grounds, I paused, then wrote 2 words, bad faith. There are choices that feel like cliff edges until your pen makes them trivial. The ink dried, and with it something inside me steadied. I did not want to punish Clara. I wanted boundaries strong enough to lift the roof back onto its pillars. I wanted to stop teaching her that my silence would carry both our weights. That evening, I returned to the apartment early. I opened the email thread and read the logistics again. Hotel, car service, schedule, breakout time, nothing illegal, everything suggestive. Discretion is a respectable word when used to protect a dignified secret. It is a mean little word when used to hide leverage. When Clara came home, she placed her bag on the counter and smiled in a way that would have satisfied any camera. "How was your day?" she asked, already reaching for her phone. "Administrative," I said. She laughed softly. "That sounds dull." It was exact. She did not ask for details. She stepped into the bedroom and closed the door with a softness that made the gesture feel like manners. I stood in the kitchen and listened to the faint sound of water in the pipes. There are moments when a life forks. They do not feel cinematic. They feel like a fan's steady metronome and a signature drying on a page most people never expect to sign. The 30th night did not end anything. It lit a pilot flame. It showed me the outline of a private theater where intimacy had been rehearsed not as healing but as instrument. And now, with the smallest fire catching, I would walk toward whatever truth required, even if it meant watching the set burn down around us. The petition moved through the clerk's office like a metal bead through a maze. Click, turn, slot. 2 days after I signed the form, we stood in Department 12 for a preliminary hearing. These sessions are meant to tidy edges before anything sharp is allowed, but edges can still cut. The judge wore the expression of a man who has seen every version of heartache and trusts paperwork more than tears. Clara arrived 1 minute before the roll call, immaculate in a smoke-gray suit that made her look as though she belonged to the building itself. She didn't glance at me, which is its own kind of glance. When our case was called, her attorney rose first. He arranged the air into a careful narrative. A recent marriage, an adjustment period, a wife asking for patience, a husband escalating to court rather than conversation. His words were measured, almost kind. Then Clara spoke. Her voice was tuned to credibility, steady but touched with restraint, as if she carried no malice, only reason. She described me as impatient, controlling in subtle ways, unwell in a fog that made our home unsafe. The room tilted toward her, rooms often do for a composed woman asking not to be rushed. Victor Park, my attorney, waited until the tilt was complete. Then he stood, binder the color of asphalt in hand. He asked for a short continuance to supplement evidence, communications, financials, travel records. "We are not here to litigate anyone's autonomy," he said evenly. We are here to address bad faith and a pattern of psychological manipulation orchestrated for leverage. The judge listened like a mechanic listening to an engine. No outrage, no warmth, only calibration. He granted 2 weeks and a narrow window for discovery. We left by separate doors. Monday morning had already swallowed the courthouse drama. I was halfway down the steps when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't know. The message contained no punctuation, only urgency. If you want the truth, ask Naomi Ward. I stared at the name until the letters blurred. A search bar told me Naomi Ward belonged to articles about Ree Caldwell, the executive from the off-site email, and to a LinkedIn profile that ended abruptly. I typed back one word, where? A pin dropped to a cafe 3 blocks away. The cafe smelled of caramel and decisions. Naomi was already seated, a woman whose tiredness had the neat edges of a newly made bed. She didn't waste breath on sympathy. I worked under Ree, she said, sliding a small drive across the table. I left with my sanity barely. You're not imagining this. On the drive, travel calendars, off-site rooming lists with 2 names boxed together, expense reports written in corporate euphemism. Alignment dinner, integration retreat, discretionary. There were chat exports where words like conditioning and leverage floated like oil on water. One phrase stood out, a nail hammered into a blank wall, intimacy strike. Naomi watched my face while I read. It's not a phrase anyone will admit to in public, but it appears. The tactic is simple, 30 days of distance to soften resistance. Not assault, she added carefully, but attrition. Closeness withheld until the other person signs what you need. Ree is careful, compartmentalized, insulated, but not invincible. People talk, systems leak. I asked her why she was helping me. She folded her hands as if remembering where they belonged. Because I kept scheduling rooms for things I told myself were normal. Because another man sat where you're sitting and he couldn't name what had been done to him. Because I don't like the person I became watching it. We built a map on napkins. Clara's calendar mirrored Ree's in 3 stretches. The off-site overlapped with our most silent nights. A car service manifest showed pickups 2 minutes apart from the same curb. Then another memory surfaced. A slim file in our marriage paperwork, a document Clara had urged me to sign when the florist was late and the caterer needed final counts. Boilerplate, she had called it. I had believed her because we were still 2 people planning a future instead of 2 people arranging narratives. Victor joined us later after his own filings. He paged through Naomi's packet with the ritual calm of someone measuring wood before he cuts. Circumstantial, he said, but coherent. With the addendum in your file, it can breathe. He looked at me. Find it. I went home and opened the cabinet where we kept warranties and their cousins. Behind a manual for a blender we never used, I found the marriage folder. The thin addendum with tidy margins lay there, brief and bloodless. The clause read, if the marriage dissolves for fraud, deception, or bad faith, the party at fault forfeits claims and returns material benefits. A tripwire disguised as caution. She had wanted it signed because she didn't think I would ever speak the word fraud. She assumed I would file for divorce plain and simple, leaving her still entitled to the split. But insurance looks harmless until you see who placed it where. I sent Victor a photo. He responded with a time. The next morning, his office smelled of toner and resolve. He began connecting the dots, Naomi's data, the off-site logs, the addendum's sharp teeth. We are not accusing crimes we cannot prove, he said. We are describing a pattern of bad faith supported by documents and behavior. That night, I lay under the fan's steady 4 count. The ache beneath my ribs was not rage. It was the slow relief of stepping out of fog and seeing the road you had walked, how long you tolerated a story that only worked if you forgot your own. Naomi texted one last warning before I slept. Ree is careful but not clean. Don't underestimate her lawyers. Keep everything. The petition had begun as a plea for space from a bed that felt like a museum exhibit. Now it was a doorway into a theater where loyalty meant leverage and boundaries were choreography. I didn't want to destroy anyone. I wanted the lying to stop. If truth required me to learn a new vocabulary for harm, the kind that leaves no fingerprint and still empties a life, I would learn it. The marriage folder lived where modern vows often go to nap, between appliance warranties and a lease addendum about pets we never owned. I slid it onto the table, flipping past glamour shots, insurance forms, and a cheerful pamphlet reminding us to update beneficiaries after major life events. Near the back, pressed flat as a leaf in a forgotten book, lay the thin document Clara had insisted I sign when the florist was late and the caterer was counting heads. Advisory addendum. 2 pages, tidy margins, language that looked harmless in the way a scalpel does before you have been cut. Victor read it aloud in clipped syllables, keeping emotion from smudging the ink. If the marriage is dissolved for fraud, deception, or bad faith, the party at fault forfeits any claim to joint property and returns any gifts, transfers, or material benefits received during the marriage. He tapped the page with his pen. Tripwire. I remembered the moment it entered our lives. Clara's hair pinned up, a champagne flute sweating against her wrist, her voice bright and practical. Boilerplate, she had said, as if safety were neutral, as if she were doing me a favor. Why would she want a clause that could strip her side of the ledger if intent was ever examined under a microscope? Perhaps she trusted I would never speak the word fraud. Perhaps she expected to hold the microphone. Naomi's packet sat beside the addendum like a reluctant cousin. Victor began cross-referencing with the patience of a craftsman measuring wood before the cut. Public ledgers, conference lists, expense reports. A hotel ledger in Midtown, printed by a machine that refused modern polish, showed 2 guests under C, Hayes and R. Caldwell. The bill was not sent to a company anyone would name at a cocktail party, but to a shell entity tied to a venture under Ree's guidance. Expense memos read like euphemistic poems. Alignment dinner, integration off-site, discretionary. A car service reservation system, scraped by someone with more access than fear, revealed recurring private bookings with tinted windows, pickup times 2 minutes apart from the same curb. It was a chain of links that didn't look like links unless you wanted them to. The chat logs filled in the spaces. In one thread, a strategist joked as if putting instructions on a coaster. Softening a spouse with 30 days of cold, turns out life hack scale. In another, someone called it the quiet month. Nothing illegal, everything effective. No one typed Clara's name, no one typed marriage. The language hid itself in metaphors, clean on paper, dirty in intent. Victor labeled tabs with the calm of a man building a small city out of paper. He did not whistle, but the silence of his work made the room hum. We will not accuse crimes we cannot prove, he said. We will describe a pattern. The addendum gives the court a door. Naomi's materials give it a hall to walk down. Late that afternoon, the strongest piece arrived without warning. Naomi texted an audio file with a note that made my throat tighten, speakerphone left on a glass table. You can hear the room. I pressed play. The sound was sharp, bouncing off hard surfaces, money in the air. Ree's voice was cold enough to chill water. 30 nights, then we talk numbers. If he files, we control optics. A rustle. Then Clara's voice, lower, careful, edged. I just need the bonus greenlit. I will keep him at arm's length. Their consonants landed like small decisions, a clink of glass, then silence. I replayed it, hoping syllables might rearrange into something less cruel. Language is loyal, it does not shift to protect you. Victor slid the addendum closer to me. This clause has teeth. It was written as decoration, but it can cut. We ask the court to treat this as fraud, or at minimum as bad faith sufficient to trigger forfeiture. He drafted motions with verbs that stood upright. No fireworks, plumbing instead, redirecting flow so what was whispered in private would be forced into the record. I walked the block while he worked. A young couple on a bench shared fries, kissing between sentences. I didn't feel envy. It was more like archaeology, recognition of ruins where a city once stood. Back inside, Victor had spread maps across the table. Calendar overlaps, receipts married to dates. The email with the subject line that still haunted me, green light bonus terms, discretion. Why did she want the clause? I asked again, though the room had already answered. Victor capped his pen. Because she believed the story would stay hers, because clauses like this look like prudence until they are forced to confess who they were built for. We called Naomi for confirmation. She didn't dramatize. Speakerphones are narcissists, she said. They assume the room belongs to them. She warned us again. Ree is careful, but even careful people live in systems, and systems leave condensation on the glass. We filed the motion the next morning. Exhibits labeled, clerk stamps cracking like miniature gavels. At home that night, I stared at the addendum again and tried to locate the exact moment when trust had been replaced by paperwork. The bruise beneath my ribs answered, not a color, but a weight. The fan kept carving the air into quarters. I thought of the argument I never gave on the 30th night, the speech about autonomy and intimacy, about how they dance when tended with care. Too late to save anything, but maybe not too late to save myself. Department 12 looked smaller the second time, as if the walls had memorized our shapes and adjusted themselves accordingly. The judge entered with the grave practicality of a man who fixes leaks, not myths. His robe whispered authority, not drama. Victor rose first, unrolling the lattice we had built over sleepless nights. The advisory addendum and its clause with teeth, the overlapping calendars, the hotel ledgers with names that bent around the truth, the car service logs like breadcrumbs with tinted windows, and finally, the audio file with Ree's cool voice and Clara's complicit echo. Clara sat composed in a dove-gray suit, a color that suggested neutrality. She did not look at me, and that very precision worked almost like eye contact. Her stillness was deliberate, the kind of calm that asks a room to lean toward her version. When her turn came, she framed everything as adjustment and privacy. Boundaries, she said. She pronounced the word like glass gently placed between two people for safety. She did not acknowledge that the pain could also blind or isolate. Ree arrived with counsel in tailored confidence. Her presence was a performance of altitude, high enough that details looked harmless from a distance. Her attorney called our evidence interpretive, a collage of logistics misread through grievance. Ree herself spoke briefly, describing dinners as mentoring, retreats as leadership training, intimacy as irrelevant. Her tone was neither affronted nor apologetic, as if daring the court to match her altitude. Victor did not chase fury. He aimed for precision. He measured out the distances. The addendum slipped into our wedding week like a hidden blade, the 30 nights of silence that aligned with Ree's travel, the expense language that said everything without saying anything, the chat exports full of euphemisms that passed compliance but not conscience. Then he pressed play. Ree's voice cooled the room. 30 nights, then we talk numbers. If he files, we control optics. Clara's voice followed, careful and low. I just need the bonus greenlit. I will keep him at arm's length. The tick of a watch ended the recording. For a moment, the entire room breathed in unison. Clara's attorney shifted the frame. He invoked trauma fatigue, a new marriage under pressure. My client asserts her bodily autonomy in the face of coercive expectations, he declared, letting the phrase hang like a chandelier. Clara's own voice added the softer version. She needed time, she needed respect, she needed dignity. Victor responded without raising volume. The husband contests neither autonomy nor consent. He contests deception. He contests intimacy being weaponized as leverage in a financial scheme. The judge's expression tightened, not in anger but in concentration, the way weather tightens before rain. He asked a single question that landed like a carpenter's tap. Counsel, who drafted this addendum? Victor answered, a consultant's name, a connection through Clara's cousin. The judge allowed a subpoena. Dean Hayes arrived with his tie crooked, a man caught between family loyalty and sworn oath. Under questioning, he admitted he had connected Clara to the consultant. He believed the clause was prudent insurance, designed to look standard while protecting her should optics sour. He claimed ignorance of any intimacy strike, but his answers shrank him with each word, like a suit worn 2 sizes too big. The tilt in the room became visible. Clara shifted, trying to bridge both narratives, boundaries and exhaustion on one side, misunderstanding and regret on the other. The chord clashed, 2 keys played at once. The judge did not lecture. He did what careful judges do. He held the matter open for supplemental evidence. He warned that if bad faith was established, the contract would enforce consequences exactly as written. His gaze lingered on the clause as if engraving it into the record a second time. Court adjourned. Outside, the world looked indifferent. Only a handful of local stringers waited, cameras hanging like tired animals. Brushed past with a silence that functioned like a line of dialogue. Clara paused, perhaps to meet my gaze, but whatever script she had rehearsed never reached her lips. I was not triumphant. Boundaries weigh more than revenge, but they do not stain your hands. In the hallway, Victor's phone buzzed. A message from Naomi, found one more thread in a trash folder. Might trace authorship of the clause. If it connects where I think it does, the tripwire is wired to her, not to you. We stood by a vending machine as strangers bought sodas, oblivious to the quiet storm rearranging our lives. Victor exhaled. Safety nets, he said, are holy only when woven from care. When spun from manipulation, the moment they bear weight, they look exactly like a noose. I carried those words out into a sky that looked colorless, like paper left too long under fluorescent lights. Back at his office, the binder lay open, the claws waiting, immaculate and bloodless. Somewhere across the city, an IT manager was opening a litigation hold email. Somewhere else, a consultant was remembering a wedding week and a favor that had sounded clever at the time. The system had not yet delivered a verdict, but the noose had been revealed, and once revealed, it could no longer be mistaken for safety. Naomi's next message arrived at dawn, when the city still smelled of damp concrete and bread trucks unloading their first deliveries. The subject line of the recovered draft sat like a confession rehearsing its first word. Regret. I carried coffee to Victor's office with a kind of hope I no longer trusted. We plugged in the drive. The draft appeared on the screen and the words waited like an indictment wrapped in polite grammar. Ree's writing read like a professional lament, self-pitying, precise, careful in tone. Boundary management framed as leadership. Distance operationalized as discipline. But in the middle, one sentence changed temperature. We operationalized 30 days of distance as leverage. Results were consistent across domestic scenarios where financial moves followed. She hadn't typed intimacy strike, but the subtext was louder than any euphemism. Attached was a single slide from a People Strategy deck, a case study with dates and shapes that mirrored my own life too neatly to dismiss as coincidence. Dry bullet points, numbers that looked harmless until you recognized the bones beneath them. Naomi had more. She had reached Laurel, a former partner of Ree's, someone who had stood on the other side of the same storm. Laurel agreed to speak if the court required it. Her statement was surgical, stripped of gossip. Versions of this tactic had appeared before, dressed in language of outcomes and leadership. Coaching through distance, Ree had called it. Discipline, focus. Laurel had walked away when she realized those words no longer meant growth but control. Victor read the draft twice, the slide 3 times. He didn't smile. He built a packet, cover letter to the firm's ethics committee, exhibits neatly tabbed, a mirror copy prepared for the court. We are not here to humiliate anyone, he said, his pen cap aligned with the page edge. We are here to stop a system from pretending it is neutral. By noon, the ethics committee confirmed receipt. By 3, an HR email placed Ree on administrative leave. She would call it misunderstanding. She would claim context. She would hire a crisis firm to sand down the language until it felt smooth enough to swallow. But for the first time in weeks, the ache beneath my ribs loosened. News does not travel evenly. Some truths move too fast, others crawl where fire should catch. Clara sensed the floor flexing beneath her before the internet even stirred. She texted me, closure, meet. We chose a lobby bench designed by someone who had never had to wait. Clara's voice arrived before her courage did. She offered money from personal accounts in exchange for sealed proceedings and mutual silence. "We can end this with dignity," she said. The dignity she meant was privacy. The weapon she wanted to bury was the same one that had cut me. "Secrecy is how this repeats," I told her. "If I take your settlement, the slide becomes rumor again." Her eyes sharpened. She pivoted as if rehearsed for both endings. Mercy hadn't worked, so she tried fear. She threatened a story of her own, hashtags already burning on her tongue, a husband obsessed with sex, coercion disguised as romance. But Victor had anticipated performances. He filed a factual statement with the court. The addendum clause, the expense ledgers, the draft titled regret, the slide, Laurel's prepared declaration. No adjectives, no victory laps, just evidence breathing in the open air. He sent the same packet to the firm's ethics committee, under Naomi's name, so they would see this not as a jealous spouse's tantrum, but an internal whistle marked with dates, authors, and attachments. The week that followed was anticlimactic in its quietness. No viral headlines, only a trade note about a senior leader stepping aside pending review. No public meltdowns, only careful posts that said less than they knew. But Clara knew. She posted her own fragments, a caption about control disguised as care. It drew a handful of hearts, then withered. Victor's statement had drained the oxygen. A blaze cannot burn in a room that has been dehumidified. Naomi, meanwhile, made her own choice. She filed her own complaint with HR, attaching the draft, the slide, and a one-page timeline signed with her initials in the corners. She texted me afterward. I chose sunlight. Laurel met us one evening across the river where the skyline looked like an apology built from glass and steel. She spoke quietly, answered what we asked, and refused to tell the story twice. "It didn't start ugly," she said. "It started as discipline, but then we applied discipline to people who had not consented to be managed. That's when I left." Her words were not fire, but steady rain, enough to soak the paper shield Ree had wrapped around herself. Victor added her statement as Exhibit N, supplementing our file. Somewhere inside a carpeted building, an ethics committee scheduled interviews. Somewhere else, a senior assistant drafted talking points with verbs designed not to embarrass. I went home to the one bedroom I had rented after leaving the condo. The fan still carved the air into quarters, but I no longer counted. I lay down and let the quiet do its work. Revenge is a noisy currency that rarely buys peace. Sunlight applied in the right places sometimes does. That night, for the first time in months, sleep came without bargaining. It simply arrived. And when morning came, it smelled again of bread. The decision arrived on a Thursday morning beneath a sky that could not decide if it wanted to be blue. We sat when the clerk told us to sit. The judge read without theatrics, his cadence steady enough that each word carried its own weight. "This court finds dissolution warranted on the grounds of bad faith and deceptive intent." No dramatics, just paragraphs with bones. He enumerated the record, the advisory addendum, the travel and expense patterns, the chat logs wrapped in euphemism, the audio file that whispered conspiracy instead of shouting it. He did not step into criminal language. He did not need to. He wrote phrases that would echo longer than punishment, patterned psychological manipulation, strategic withholding to obtain leverage, contractual deception. The addendum would be enforced. Clara would forfeit claims to joint assets. She would return gifts and transfers received during the marriage. She would also bear a portion of my legal fees. The judge spoke as if reporting weather. "The front has arrived, and this is the rain." Clara did not cry. She did not argue. She looked down as though reading a script written in the margins of her own hands. Ree was absent, her altitude punctured by an administrative leave that had already turned to resignation. Victor leaned toward me and whispered, "Effective immediately." That is how some doors close quietly, but without hinges left to salvage. The aftershocks arrived faster than the verdict. By noon, an HR message suspended Clara pending review. Clients who once sought her polish began requesting reassignment. 2 firms site-linked the trade note about Ree's fall. Admiration turned tentative. Colleagues spoke of her in careful past tense. I walked home through a city that barely noticed. No swarming press. No viral commentary. Just traffic lights changing on schedule and strangers buying coffee. There was no celebration in me. The ruling sat on my chest like a book I had needed to finish, but could no longer remember why I started it. Where tenderness might have grown, a vacuum hummed, oddly bright, oddly clean. Victor came later with paper and a plan. "You don't have to turn pain into a project," he said, "but if you want to, I'll draft the bylaws." We named it Quiet Boundaries, a small council grant for people with credible evidence of manipulation tied to economic control. Prenups hustled through cold months. Contracts signed while love was rationed. Naomi agreed to triage emails twice a week. "I speak the dialect," she said. "I can tell when someone says I'm fine in a voice that means help me name this." The first week was a trickle, 2 spam-scented messages and one from a man describing his last year in metaphors. Cold months, moving goalposts, withdrawals requested after hope was shrunk. He attached polite texts that were cruel in their precision and a spreadsheet that read like erosion. Naomi marked it credible. I signed the first disbursement. It wasn't redemption, it was direction. At home, the fan carved the room into quarters. I tried to read, but my eyes floated to the edges of the page where breath lives. I thought of the judge's steady cadence, how mercy and boundaries can sound the same when delivered without performance. An email arrived from Clara, 3 words, no punctuation. "Can we talk?" It was neither apology nor threat, just a door left ajar. I did not answer. Silence can wound, but it can also be a threshold held open until the room inside is ready for truth. Victor sent me a photo of the filed order, the stamp dark as a bruise. Naomi forwarded a thank you note from someone we hadn't yet helped, grateful simply that the intake form had language for what they had endured. I thought I was crazy. It helps to know this has a name. That night I walked to the river. The water kept its promise, carrying away what did not belong. Somewhere Ree was drafting a new narrative. Somewhere Clara was learning what happens when a safety net is woven not from care but from strategy. I did not wish them ruin. I wished them an inventory as honest as the one I had been handed. On the way back, I passed a couple arguing softly, careful not to break tomorrow. I hoped they found the words. At home, I turned off the fan and let the silence settle. No applause, no encore. Just air large enough to hold the outline of something new. And in the morning, the sky finally chose a color, ordinary blue, which felt for once like grace. The lobby had the acoustics of expensive discretion, marble floors that made footsteps sound like apologies. I saw her before she saw me. Clara, carrying a cardboard box with a braided desk plant, 2 framed certificates, and a mug that declared outcomes, not excuses. Her face looked smaller, not in beauty but in certainty, as if scaffolding had been stripped away and the building had to stand on its own bones. She noticed me without surprise. 5 minutes, she asked, the words shaped more like a request than a weapon. We sat on a bench designed by someone who had never endured waiting. Clara didn't perform, no curated tremble, no sighs rehearsed for sympathy. "I was afraid," she admitted. Afraid of being ordinary, afraid of climbing a ladder only to find it vanish beneath me, afraid of money evaporating faster than youth. She stared at the mug, then set it down as though it had become too heavy. I told myself boundaries were distance and strategy was safety. It worked until it didn't. I let silence do what words rarely manage, she went on. Ree spoke in verbs that sounded like armor, discipline, focus, remove friction. I liked the math of it. Math always tells you where you stand, but I didn't see I was building a machine that could only run on someone else's pain. I did not absolve. I didn't weigh her regrets against the nights I carried them. Not touching was always your right, I said, finally giving the sentence I should have spoken on the 30th night. But training me with absence was not. She nodded, slow, astonished, as if realizing her house had burned and she'd been living in the smoke. I kept thinking if I performed better, the facts would adjust, she whispered. Turns out the facts don't watch the show. We sat long enough to hear 3 elevators arrive and depart as though the building itself was breathing. "I'm sorry," she said at last. No adjectives, no scaffolding, just a plain plank laid across water. And I believed her not as absolution but as weather, true because it matched what was outside the window. "I wish you a life that doesn't depend on anyone else's soft spots," I replied. We did not hug. Some endings belong to geometry, not choreography. She lifted the box again, balanced the mug on top like a fragile moon, and walked toward the revolving door. It accepted her in quarters and returned her to the street. Outside, winter had loosened its grip. The air belonged to itself instead of the month printed on the calendar. My phone buzzed. Victor had sent a photo of a spreadsheet I didn't need to read to understand. Quiet Boundaries had just funded its 5th case. Another spouse, coerced during a curated cold spell, now had counsel. The kind of counsel that knows what to ask and when to let silence finish the sentence. Naomi forwarded a note from someone we had helped cover the review of a prenup. "Thank you for naming what I couldn't. I thought endurance was love. Turns out love doesn't need me to disappear to exist. I read it twice, then closed it. I no longer needed relics to prove survival." I walked down to the river where the city rehearses humility. The current carried its burdens, a plastic bag shaped briefly like a bird, a twig, a leaf that had traveled farther than it should. There was no cinematic revenge waiting at the far bank, no collapse in slow motion. Justice was quieter than that. It looked like a clause that bit back at the hand that wrote it. It looked like a strategy unspooled the moment it was named out loud. It looked like strangers finding language for what had been done to them, so they had options beyond silence. On the way home, a street musician tuned his guitar with the patience of someone who knows not to rush the part before music. I thought about applause, our way of proving we were present when something mattered. But not every truth needs noise to make it real. At the apartment, the fan still carved the air into 4s, steady and indifferent. The room was mine again. Not because I had scrubbed it clean, but because I had stopped renting it out to silence. I set my phone down without checking it. I poured water into a glass I liked for no reason other than liking it. I stood at the window while the neighbor's porch light flickered between on and off, undecided but honest. I drew a breath that crossed the room without needing permission. It came back whole. For the first time since the wedding photos were fresh from the printer, I could see the outline of a life that did not depend on anyone else's loss. No applause, no triumph, something quieter, something better. Peace that does not demand another's ruin. That judgment didn't arrive with fireworks. It landed like weather, bad faith, deceptive intent, consequences enforced. No applause, no victory parade, just a clean line between boundary and leverage. Here's the lesson I'm taking with me. Autonomy is sacred. Turning intimacy into currency is not. Love does not require silence, scarcity, or a ledger. If someone makes you disappear to prove they care, they don't. What would you have done on the 30th night? Would you wait, confront, or walk toward the truth even if it burns the set down? Tell me in the comments. If this story resonated like the video, subscribe to Cheating Stories 7 and share it with someone who needs language for what they've lived. Your support helps us bring more stories where quiet harm finally gets a name. Thank you for watching. I'm leaving you with peace, not vengeance. The next story starts soon.